Good afternoon. I'm going to practice the Zoom application to improve my skills with sharing various screens and whatnot. To do that today, I'm going to talk about the myth that there is very little or no flu going about with at the same time that COVID's here. That all we hear about is COVID, and it pushes out all the flu, and nobody talks about flu, and there's nobody dying from flu. And I'll also mention the claim that COVID is similar to a bad flu season. And to do this, I'll share my screen where we'll look at some CDC information and a reformatting of CDC numbers within a spreadsheet that I've created so that we can look at averages and deltas from averages. So let's start by sharing the CDC numbers. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted to do. And it's sharing the Zoom, not the CDC. So the CDC has a weekly flu surveillance and a weekly and a estimate of past seasons. First, we'll talk about the weekly flu surveillance report. There's a lot of different measures, a lot of different things that they observe. What I find most useful during the pandemic has been this mortality data. The chart's interesting, but I find the data itself to be more useful. What the chart shows us is over the past few seasons from 2014, the flu seasons have trended in a predictable manner, with 2017 to 18 being a peak, and then having a very significant peak this year during the COVID pandemic. If you load this data, or you get this data, open it with a spreadsheet, you can see this is, I have to share my screen again, a different screen. So I stop this share, and I'll start a different share with the spreadsheet that came up. And so this is the data that creates that chart. And we can see it goes back as far as 2013, and it gives the totals for each week in the year. It gives a percent of the total number of deaths due to pneumonia and influenza. It gives the expected percentage threshold, which would be the epidemic threshold. And it gives the number of all deaths, the number of pneumonia deaths, and the number of influenza deaths. Now, this is a bit cumbersome of a way to look at the data. So what I have done is I have switched the, rearranged the data and only kept those fields that I have data for all years. So I excluded 2013. I started with 2014, and we only go through to the 29th week of 2020. So for basically the last 6 years is the data that I look at for the first 29 weeks of the year. And what I've done is I created an average of the number of all deaths for that week, a delta for the 2020 year, and average of the pneumonia deaths, a delta for the pneumonia deaths, an average for the influenza deaths, and a delta for the 2020 influenza deaths. And what we can see that is very much of interest to me, has been, is that we have a spike in what is referred to as excess deaths that coincides with the pandemic. So in week 14, we had an excess number of deaths of 15,000, and then 20 1 in 20, and we can see that the number of excess deaths has been declining. One thing to note about these, if more deaths than average is excess deaths, then one would suppose that less than average would be surplus lives. But what we have here from my past experience is a lag time. These numbers will increase as the bureaucratic process makes its way through. Also of interest, we note that pneumonia has a significant spike around the same time. It is presumed, well, I presume that a fair number of the pneumonia deaths are related to COVID, not to flu, but this doesn't distinguish, so there's no way for me, uneducated beyond these numbers, to know anything about it. But on the point of the flu, here are the averages, and here's the delta for this season. And you can see that all throughout the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, until the last week or two, we had more flu deaths this year than the average over the years. And if you go and you see influenza deaths in 2020, you'll see we have hundreds of deaths each week, and that largely corresponds to other years, excluding the 2018 year where we had a more severe outbreak. We're far below that severe outbreak for the flu deaths. But if you look at some of the other years, we are well above, for example, 2017 or 2016 and 15. So we had a worse than average year in regards to flu. At the same time, we had a very severe respiratory illness in COVID-19. And that's what the CDC has been telling us. If you're hearing from other sources that there is no flu, or that the flu numbers are smaller than average or anything like that, those sources are in disagreement with the CDC. It is not that the CDC is trying to hide anything from you. It's just not being reported as widely as normally would be. And let's talk a minute about the severity of COVID in relation to past years of the flu. They make estimates rather than that surveillance for the past year, because the number of infections, etc., aren't going to all be recorded, aren't going to go through the bureaucratic process and be known to the CDC, from my understanding. But these are the estimates. These are the numbers that are typically thrown around that I've seen. In 2017 and 18, we had a high number of 61,000. That's the highest number out of the past 10 years. Second highest would be 2014 and 15. Two seasons, 17, 18, and 18, 19, they're reserving the right to adjust, so that may go up or down, I suppose. But as you can see, even the worst year for the entire year is less than half of the number of deaths that we currently have on the Worldometer site tracking the COVID-19 deaths. Even if this is somewhat inflated by, say, 30%, we still have far fewer deaths than the worst flu season in the last 10 years. Given that most of these deaths have occurred within the last 3 or 4 months, it's much worse than just simply comparing the numbers. So here are the total deaths. Today is July 30th. 3 months ago, April 30th, we had 65,000 deaths. So we have nearly 100,000 deaths within the last 3 months, May, June, and July. At 152, that would give us roughly just under 90,000, or 154, and give us just under 90,000 deaths within a 3-month time period. So the number of deaths in COVID is not anything comparable to the estimates that one gets from the CDC for the flu. So if your numbers are, if you're getting numbers of a much greater, higher numbers from another source, that source would agree with the CDC. Are their estimates better or worse? That's a debatable issue, but traditionally we have gone to the CDC to look for those kinds of numbers. So anyway, that was the numbers that we see from the CDC. Those are the numbers that have been considered most reliable up until recently, when the theories that are commonly described as conspiracy theories became popular, and we were told that the numbers were being faked because a lot of people were showing up dead in morgues associated with COVID-19. One wonders where dead people would go if they weren't going to morgues and funeral homes and that sort of thing. It would be relatively surprising, I suppose, for the dead to simply go to the polls. But at any rate, the CDC numbers have traditionally been considered reliable, and we can see from those numbers that the flu season was still with us this year. Is likely to come back in the fall as normal. We had a above average flu, a more severe than average flu season this spring, and so when we hear from people that there is no flu, that's just simply not what's being recorded by the CDC. Thank you for your time. Hope you have a good afternoon.